There's a major reason why we pay a lot of attention to these people, and that is because these are pretty much the only Stoics of whose writings have come to us pretty much intact, or in large part. We have lost most of the writings from, Chrysippus wrote 72 books apparently. Talk about somebody who writes, prodigiously, but we don't have any of them left. We only have fragments, and we only have commentaries by other people about the early Stoics. The late Stoics, on the other hand, Seneca the Younger, who was a senator, influential senator, and advisor of Nero, Epictetus, who was a slave initially and then a teacher, and of course Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor. Of these people, we do have a lot of writings, especially Seneca. There is a lot of Seneca that has actually survived. So a lot of what we know about Stoicism is actually either from commentaries and secondary sources, ancient sources, or from these guys firsthand. Let me tell you a bit about the other, where Stoicism came from, and the other rivals, let's say, to the school at the time. This was a very interesting time in Greek and Roman history, the Hellenistic period. The Stoics were influenced by Socrates, just like all of the Hellenistic schools, to a larger or lesser degree. And in particular by the Cynics, who I've already mentioned. Zeno was initially studying with the Cynics. Now the Cynics were an interesting bunch. They were very, very minimalist philosophers. I mean, these people were going around in rags with a knapsack containing all their possessions. They had no job. They had no possessions, no family, no dwellings, nothing. This is the painting there. Shows one of the famous stories. There's lots of famous and funny stories about the Cynics, particularly Diogenes, who was the most famous of the Cynics. And there's Diogenes on the right, who is just taking the sun in his tub. He was living in a tub in Athens. And Alexander the Great is the fellow on the left. He paid homage. He went to visit Diogenes because Diogenes was so famous, despite the fact that he owned nothing. And Alexander said, you are such a famous and influential philosopher. Here I am, Alexander the Great. And anything you like, you can just ask, and I will give to you. And Diogenes' response was, sure, get out of the sun. And that was the only thing he asked of Alexander the Great. So we're talking that kind of minimalism, right? Now, some of the other schools that were around at the time, you may have heard of, and may know something of. So there were the Platonists, named, of course, after Plato, who was one of Socrates' students. Aristotle, who was a student of Plato. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are often referred to as the dream team of ancient philosophy. Plato established his own school, the Academy. Aristotle established his own school, the Lyceum. Epicurus, who also established his own school, the Garden. Pyrrho, who was the founder of the Skeptics, not in the modern sense of the term skeptic, but in the ancient philosophical sense of the term. And then you might or might not recognize the last one over there, Paul of Tarsus, right? The guy who actually really built Christianity, not Jesus, because we don't know what the hell Jesus did or said. What we do know is Paul. And basically what we know of as Christianity today is Paul. And it's interesting that it is Paul, because Paul actually was very much aware of the Stoics. He knew Seneca's brother. And in fact, for a while, there was these documents that allegedly were a correspondence between Seneca and Paul. It turns out that it was a forgery. The two never, gasp. Imagine that. The two never actually corresponded. But clearly, Paul and the early Christians were very much aware of the Stoics, as well as they were aware, of course, of all the other schools that I'm talking about. So that's in terms of origin and sort of competitors. In terms of influences, although all the Hellenistic schools of philosophy were closed down at some point in the 5th century by the Emperor Justinian I, who was a Byzantine emperor, and that was the result of, that was the last straw of the rise of Christianity, basically. So Christianity took over, essentially, Europe throughout the Middle Ages, and that was the end of all of the schools, not just the Stoics. But the last influential Stoic that we know of is actually Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century. That doesn't mean that Stoicism as an idea died. It had influences all over the place. Some of the people that were clearly influenced, because either they tell us so or it's very clear from what they wrote, was Paul, as I said, and a number of the other early church fathers, to the point that a number of monks in monasteries, in Christian monasteries throughout the Middle Ages, actually used Epictetus' handbook as their book of meditation and their book of course, every time that Epictetus referred to Socrates, which he does often in the handbook, the Christians replaced it with Jesus. But yeah, right, a little bit of editorializing, it's okay. Boetius, Thomas Aquinas, a lot of Renaissance humanists, Giordano Bruno, Thomas More, Erasmus, Montaigne, a little later on, Francis Bacon in England, Descartes was highly influenced by Stoic, the guy that I think, therefore I am. Montesquieu, Spinoza very much, so modern existentialism, and finally even something called Neo-Orthodox Protestant theology, which I have no idea what the hell it is. But sure, it's there. And finally, we get to modern day. So modern day, I think that Stoicism's closest contemporary kins are secular humanism and secular Buddhism. And for a variety of reasons, which I think will become clear throughout the rest of the talk. There is a lot of similarities. There are some interesting differences, but there are also a lot of similarities between Buddhism and Stoicism. And in fact, you can sort of think of, at a first approximation, you can think of Stoicism as the Western equivalent or the Western response to Buddhism to some extent. Okay, here's another quote from Epictetus. Consider at what price you sell your integrity, but please, for God's sake, don't sell it cheap. Again, you can see the sense of humor. Integrity is important. Why is it important? Because Stoicism is a type of virtue ethics. For the Stoics, just like a number of virtue ethical philosophies at the time, the most important thing in life is your integrity, is your character. Okay? And you're supposed to be practicing that integrity, practicing the virtues. We'll talk about the virtues in a minute. But that is the fundamental component of Stoic philosophy. Stoicism is a system, meaning that it has actually it's a coherent whole. Like all systems, it may actually have things that work or don't work particularly well, and modern Stoics do pick and choose, of course, because these are people who wrote 2,000 years ago, before a lot of modern science and before a lot of modern philosophy even. But nonetheless, I'm going to present you the basic idea of the system so that you can appreciate where they come from. So the Stoics used a lot of metaphors to explain what they meant. And one of the best metaphors, I think, is of the entire system is as a garden. They said, okay, if you think of Stoicism as a garden, then the fence is the logic. I'll tell you in detail in a minute what logic, physics, and ethics actually mean here. But by the logic, they essentially meant, the way you reason about things, not just in the technical meaning of the term logic that we have today. It's just the way of reasoning. So logic is the fence because it defends you against other ways of thinking. It protects your system. The nurturing ground is the physics. By physics, as you'll see in a minute, they meant really the best understanding we can possibly have of how the world works. And their idea was that you cannot live a good life unless you understand how the world works. So the physics is what nourishes. It's the ground that nourishes. Nourishes what? Nourishes the fruits that comes out of the garden. And those fruits are the ethics. The ethics here, again, is intended, as most of the ancient Greco-Romans did, not in the narrow sense that we mean today, not in the sense of just, the answer to questions of right and wrong, but in the broader sense of how are you supposed to live your life. Ethics, for the ancients, was the study of how to live your life. Okay? So it's the fruit of what you get once you apply, essentially, reason and science, if you want to put it in modern terms. Now, let's take a quick look at each one of these three in turn. We'll take a very quick look at the physics and the logic, and then the rest is going to be on the ethics because it's the important stuff. The more practical stuff, I should say. So a little bit of Stoic physics. Don't think of these as theories in the modern scientific sense of the term, obviously. Right? There was no established science at the time. These people were doing what we will call natural philosophy today. Okay? They were just trying to understand the world as the best that they could. They had no Hubble Space Telescope. They had no Large Hadron Collider available. Nonetheless, they did think that the universe started at a particular point in time with a primordial fire, And then it's going to end eventually with the same fire. And in fact, it's going to start over. It's kind of interesting to think that some modern cosmological models suggest something like that. But please don't read the Stoics as somehow anticipating modern cosmology. That's just baloney. Okay? Whenever people, I mean, it's funny to me, it's like, oh, the ancient atomists got the idea of atom right. No, they didn't. Okay? They got nothing to do, what they meant by atom has nothing to do with what modern physicists mean by atom. So, yeah, they got an interesting idea right. That is that the universe has a beginning and it's going to have an end. And by the way, they thought of a very long span between this beginning and end. They never said exactly when. But that one they got right. But, you know, they got it right by intuition, certainly not by science. They did agree with modern thinking that the world is made of matter. So they were physicalists. They were materialists. They understood causation as being universal. Everything in the universe is connected by cause and effect. So these are all very modern ideas that we can still sort of accept at a broad level. And then they thought that the cosmos are organized rationally, what they call the logos. Now, this is where you can take what the logos means in different ways. If you are theologically inclined, you can think of the logos as God and say, well, yeah, sure, God created the universe and blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. That actually is consistent with some Stoics' writings. Stoics did write about God, although they didn't think of God as a personal God. God was immanent in the universe, was the same thing as the universe, essentially. And it was material, by the way. It was made of matter. So you can take it that way, or you can take it as a modern secular humanist would, or a modern atheist would, that is to indicate simply the idea that the universe is understandable on the basis of logic and empirical evidence, which is true, otherwise we wouldn't have science to begin with. So that's up to you how you take that one. Now, the result of all this, what they got out of the physics, is that one of their fundamental ideas, which is that life is to be lived according to nature. And what they mean by that is according to human nature. And what they mean by human nature is the nature of a rational, social animal. For the Stoics, the Stoics got from their understanding of how the world works that we are social animals capable of reason. And that therefore, the best way to live your life is socially applying reason. That's the basis. That's one of the fundamental ideas that we have from Stoicism. What about the logic? So, by logic, they meant both what we mean today by logic, the technical study of formal reasoning and that sort of stuff. They also meant what we mean today by epistemology, that is a theory of knowledge. How is it that people get knowledge? And also what we today would call cognitive science or psychology, that is the study of how human reasoning works or fails to work sometimes. They were very concerned about what we today would call the logical fallacies, because those are the kind of things that can lead you astray and therefore make wrong decisions about your life, right? So they introduced something called propositional logic, which was very different from Aristotelian logic, which was obviously popular at the time. And actually it's very similar to modern logic. Stoic logic came back into fashion at the end of the 19th century because it's very similar to the kind of logic that modern logicians actually are doing. They thought that knowledge can be attained through reason, and that we are in principle capable of separating true from false. Okay? This is one of the things that they disagree with the skeptics. The skeptics said there is no such thing as knowledge. Humans don't have knowledge. Okay? They cannot claim knowledge. The Stoics said, well, actually, yes, ideally at least we can. And then finally, that knowledge can only be achieved by peer expertise and collective judgment. This is, if you think about it, it's a very modern concept. This is essentially the concept of modern science. Right? The idea that knowledge cannot be acquired by just thinking by yourself about the universe, because it's too easy to fool yourself that you got it right. What you need to do is to compare your ideas with your peers, with people that understand things at least as well, if not better, than you do, and to have this open conversation in a sort of arrive at a collective judgment. So knowledge for the Stoics was a collective enterprise, not an individual enterprise. All of this, as I said, was in the service of nurturing ethics. The physics, that is what we will today call natural science and metaphysics, as well as the logic, were in the service of the ethics. The reason they studied those other two was not because they were just curious about the universe in general. They wanted to know how the universe works, and they wanted to know how reason works because they wanted to live a good life, the best life that is possible. So here's Epictetus again, introducing the ethics and the idea that it's all about virtue. Ask me what the real good in men's case is, and I can only say that it is the right kind of moral character. This is a fundamental concept, as I say, in Stoicism. The measure of a good man or woman, of course, there are modern versions of the Stoic writings where the writings are gender neutral, which I'm pretty sure if the Stoics were writing today, they would write in gender neutral terms. But I picked the original version, which of course talks almost always about men. There are a few examples of Stoic women actually in history, but most of it, of course, is about dead white men. Anyway, it's all about character. So what does it mean to be all about character? It means that you develop a good character if you develop 4 fundamental virtues. These virtues were imported by Christians themselves in their system. These are the 4 cardinal virtues in Christianity, and for good reasons. Wisdom, particularly practical wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to make the best decisions under any given circumstances. It's a practical thing. It's a question of whatever you're faced with. If you're wise, you take the best course of action that is available at that moment. Courage, by which they didn't mean just courage in battle. They meant the courage to do the right thing, the courage to face situations that are unpleasant, and so on and so forth, or people who are unpleasant. We'll see a quote about this in a minute. Justice. I'll have a separate slide about justice because the Stoics were very much involved into social activities, into social politics even, but certainly into issues of social justice. This was not an inward-looking philosophy, unlike, for instance, Epicureanism. Epicurus very clearly said, stay away from politics and in the social world because that only causes pain. He did have a point there. It does cause a lot of pain, But the Stoics were actually very much into social action. And then temperance. Temperance is the idea that you want to, self-control. You want to exercise self-control. You want to always do things by the right measure, not in any kind of excess. If you practice these 4 things, whether you buy into the rest of the Stoic system or not, you are a Stoic. Okay. A fundamental idea of Stoic ethics is the so-called Stoic fork. And I'm going to introduce it by another quote from Epictetus. That's Epictetus, by the way, over there. Some things are under our control. Other things are not under our control. Now, that seems trivial, but you wouldn't believe how many people forget this kind of stuff, okay? And, of course, the wisdom there is to figure out, well, which things exactly are under my control and which things exactly are not under my control, right? So, for instance, to try to give the best talk that I can at this moment is under my control because I prepare for it, I'm responsible for the slides, I read the texts, and so on and so forth. To convince you that Stoicism is something to pay attention as soon as you walk out of this, it's not under my control. Right? I can influence it, but it's not under my control. It's up to you. And therefore, my goal should be here not to convince people, but only to deliver the best talk that I can. Right? So my desire is simply to deliver the best talk that I can. Whatever happens afterwards is up to you. It's outside of my control. And if I start worrying about things that are outside of my control, then I'm just going to have a miserable life, according to Epictetus. Okay? All right, fine, the virtues. But what about the rest of life? I mean, we're not all going around all being virtuous and that's it. There's other things. There's drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and all sorts of other stuff, right? So what about all that other stuff? Here's, I think, where the Stoics really got it right and where they really were brilliant. Let me set up this thing for a minute because it takes a little bit of background to understand where I'm coming from. I mentioned the Cynics, right? For the Cynics, who at the time were a dominant school, influential, not dominant, but influential school. For the Cynics, virtue was the only thing that mattered. Everything else is go to hell. In fact, everything else is distracting. Okay? So if you have property, family, friends, it's all a distraction. It distracts you from the thing, which is virtue. As you can imagine, the Cynics never became particularly popular.
Distraction from what?
From virtue, from practicing virtue. That's it, right? So never been very popular as a, the ascetic lifestyle is never very popular. It's always out there. There are people still today, right? Buddhist monks, for instance, who do practice, and some Christians who do practice ascetic life. But it's not the kind of thing that is going to go mainstream. It's not going to go viral, okay? Now, at the opposite extreme, there were people like the Epicureans and the Cyrenaics who thought that it was all about pleasure. Now, pleasure qualified. Epicurus wasn't about debauchery and that sort of stuff. He was actually a very measured kind of guy. But still, it's about pleasure. So it's about the externals in life. It's about getting the right amount of external goods that make your life pleasant. Aristotle was very similar. Aristotle was kind of in between. Aristotle said that virtue is the most important thing, but these other stuff is important as well. You also want to be, healthy, wealthy, educated, good-looking, and so on and so on. Aristotle actually said that. If you're not good-looking, you're not going to be happy. Go figure. So the Stoics thought, okay, wait a minute here. There is some truth in all of this. We just need to look at it from a different perspective, in a different way. The truth that they agreed with is that virtue, character, integrity is in fact the most important thing. It is the chief good. Why? Well, because they said you're going to be able to evaluate your life at the time it's about to end. And if you look back at your life and you say, what are you going to say to yourself? Say, oh yeah, I got another car, yet another car, or I got yet another house, or I got yet another, piece of entertainment, whatever it is. That's what's worth it. Now that's what most of us, I think, would say, no. That's not the kind of thing you're going to be proud of. You may have enjoyed it while it happened, but this is not the kind of thing that you want to leave to your children and say, your dad really got this many cars and this many, and so on, unless you're Donald Trump, of course, in which case. So, virtue is what you want to, integrity is what you're proud of. You have to have lived a good life, meaning to have lived a life as a good person, that other people have good things to say about you, not because they want to flatter you, but because you really were a good person, because you really did interact well with the rest of with your family, you did do well with your children, with your spouses, and so on and so forth. So they agreed that is the top priority. But they also said, yeah, but there's these other things. They're not as irrelevant as the cynics think, and they're not as important as the Aristotelians think. So we call them preferred and dispreferred indifference. Now, the word preferred indifference seems like an oxymoron. It's like, how can it be preferred if it is indifferent? It's preferred because other things being equal, you want to be healthy, wealthy, educated, and so on and so forth, as opposed to sick, poor, ignorant, and so on and so forth. But it is indifferent, meaning that that's not going to have anything to do with your ability to live a moral life. Anybody, according to the Stoics, can live a good moral life, regardless of whether they are sick or healthy, poor or wealthy, educated or ignorant. The moral life is accessible to everybody. That said, if fortune, if fate sends your way health, a little bit of wealth, and things that you can enjoy, by all means, enjoy them. But remember, those are not the important things in life. You can enjoy them, and then you can lose them. And if you lose them, you're not supposed to regret them. One thing that Epictetus keeps saying is, never think of anything you have as your stuff. Think of it as you borrowed it from the universe. So when you lose it, and this goes, by the way, not just for stuff, but also for people. John, I know, I just lost a very dear friend recently. And Epictetus would say, well, you didn't lose it because it wasn't yours. You just gave it back to the universe. You enjoyed it for many decades, and you were lucky to do so. But now it's gone, and you don't regret it. You just move forward.
It's like public property, right? It's like goes to somebody else.
You're recycled. Actually, Marcus Aurelius several times uses words similar to, you're recycled in the unit. Your atoms get dispersed, and you become something else. How am I doing on time? All right. Now, I mentioned justice as one of the Stoic virtues. Justice is an inherently social virtue. Right? Justice has to do with society, with the way you interact with other people. The other one's not necessarily. I mean, courage, you can display courage even on your own. But justice is definitely inherently social. The Stoics and the Cynics were actually the ones that invented the term and used the concept of cosmopolitanism. The word cosmopolitan, that is citizen of the world, comes actually from Cynic and Stoic philosophy. And they were very conscious of this idea of being a citizen of the world. What you're looking at there is it's called Hierocles circles. Hierocles was a Roman Stoic, and he taught. We have only fragments of what he wrote, but we do have some fragments. And one of these fragments talk about how you're supposed to relate to the rest of humanity. You cannot read it from there, but the central circle is you. The Stoics, unlike the Buddhists, were very much into self. They agreed that there is such a thing as a self, and you are you. That's it. And any consideration about the rest of you starts with you, not because you are more important, but because you is you. You are the one making doing those considerations, right? The next circle is your family, the people that are close to you, right? Your children, your spouse, and so on, or your parents. The circle after that is your friends. The circle after that is people in your city, or your polis, to use the Greek term. And then after that is the people in your nation. And then after that is all of humanity. And the idea was that, you may have heard of modern versions of this. Peter Singer, who is a utilitarian ethicist, talks about the expanding circle of concern, of ethical concern. For Hierocles, it was almost the opposite. He thought of this as a collapsing circle of concerns, meaning that you're supposed to bring in the external circles closer and closer to you, so that you care more and more about people that are actually far from you. And he actually had technique. The Stoics were very big in practical techniques. He had techniques about doing this. He says, so in order to do this, when you walk in the streets and you meet somebody who you don't know, but he's a little older than you are, call him uncle. Or if it's somebody your age, call him brother or sister. Because that is a way in which you can train yourself to think of them as brothers and sisters and uncles and members of your family. You keep bringing them in. And if you do that for most of your life, then you really start feeling like they are in fact part of your family. So here's Epictetus, as the way he put it is do as Socrates did, or if you're a Christian, do as Jesus did. Never reply to the question of where he was from with I am Athenian or I am from Corinth, but always I am a citizen of the world. Now, the next little topic that I want to bring up is misconceptions about Stoicism. I don't know what you guys have heard about Stoicism before. I mean, I know some of you have actually heard quite a bit, but some of you may not have. And yeah, it's more like this, right? Yeah. Most people today, if they think about Stoicism, they think about Spock. There is a reason for that, as it turns out. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, actually designed the character of Spock after the Stoics. He was supposed to be the Stoic on Star Trek. The problem is that Roddenberry, for all his brilliance, didn't do much research on what Stoics were supposed to be like. And so we get, of course, the picture of the extremely logical, lacking empathy, lacking emotions kind of guy. That's not what Stoicism is supposed to be. And so that's a caricature, unfortunately. As much as I love Spock, it is a caricature of Stoicism. The Stoics did not, in fact, seek to suppress emotions. What they thought was that you need to transform emotions. You need to look at emotions and separate the good ones, the positive ones, from the negative ones. Okay? You have to apply your judgment to emotions. Emotions are a natural part of being a human being, so you cannot suppress them. There's no way you can avoid them even if you wanted to. What you can do is to look at the emotion that you're having, like fear, for instance, or lust, or whatever, and look at it and try to create some distance between you and emotion and say, well, who are you, and am I supposed to give you assent or not? Are you a good idea or not? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. The goal is to achieve, through this process, some degree of inner calm. Here's Epictetus' modern version. Keep calm and carry on. So they distinguished between propatos, which are the instinctive reactions we all have. If you see a threat, you're gonna be afraid. You're gonna have fear. That's an instinctive reaction. Okay? There's just adrenaline is gonna rush through. There's nothing you can do about it. It's a natural reaction of human beings. But they distinguish those from what they call eupathos, which are the feelings resulting from correct judgment. So you stop and you say, wait, why am I afraid? Oh, because I've heard a sound in the other room. Well, is the other sound a burglar? Is it a ghost? Or is it more likely my cat? Go check it out. If it's your cat, then you don't need to be afraid, unless you have a really big cat. Right? The goal, ultimately, was to reach what the Stoics call apatheia. Now, apatheia is, of course, related to the modern word apathy, but it doesn't mean apathy. In fact, quite different. It means peace of mind, in the sense of something that results from a clear judgment and the maintenance of equanimity in life. So you achieve apatheia when you go through life knowing the difference between what is good and what is not good, knowing the difference between what is really dangerous and what is not, knowing the difference between what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. That's the kind of inner calm. So in that sense, the Stoics are like Spock. They're calm, but they're calm because out of knowledge and out of cultivating positive emotions, not out of suppressing emotions. Okay, fine. What about the practice? I mean, people presumably are interested in practice if they're interested, not necessarily in ancient philosophy. So very briefly, I'm going to give you a list of Stoic so-called spiritual exercises. There's a number of them, actually. We did a Stoic camp with a friend of mine recently where some of the people that are here came. And by the end of the camp, I think we listed something like 32 or 33 exercises on the board that you could do. So there's a lot that can be done. This is going to just give you an idea of some of the main ones. In order to sort of answer the question, well, okay, so what does it look like if I actually were interested in this practically as opposed to just reading the text, right? For instance, what I do fairly regularly is, I start my morning with a morning meditation. The morning meditation is simply finding a quiet place in your apartment. And I know this is New York. It's difficult, but, it can be done. And think about the day ahead. Think about the challenges you might encounter in the day ahead. A meeting at work, or in my case, teaching my students, or having to do with colleagues, or whatever it is. And visualize those instances and trying to think ahead of time about the challenges and remind yourself of which virtues you might be in need of or called for in order to deal with those challenges. The three in the middle are things that, well, actually, the second and the third are things that I don't do every day, but I do it at least once a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. The view from above is, and you can do it any time of the day. It doesn't have to be the morning. The view from above is it's a visualization where you start looking at yourself from above. So you picture yourself in your mind. You close your eyes, and then you sort of zoom out, and you start looking at yourself from further and further away until you see your apartment, and people live in your building, and then people live in your city, the country, the planet, and you keep zooming out as far as you can, all the way to the parallel universes if you can get there. Why? This is a way to remind yourself of the fact that you're a minute part of a larger, much, much larger cosmos, and that your own problems are really not that important in the large scheme of things. They're important to you. This is not a way to minimize your problems. It's a way of reminding yourself to putting them in perspective. Right? The premeditatio malorum is an interesting exercise. This is the idea of thinking ahead, visualizing again, really bad stuff that can happen to you. And again, the goal here is to get ready for it, to prepare yourself mentally for it. Now, the most difficult kind of premeditatio malorum that you can do, which literally means thinking about bad stuff in Latin, it's about thinking about your own death. Right? So there are some people, some practitioners who actually do suggest to do that on a number of occasions, because that is something that's going to happen, and it is something that you want to be prepared for. As Seneca famously said, we are dying every day. So every day is a process by which you get closer and closer to it, and so you might as well be ready, because that's going to be your ultimate test of character, how you get to that point. Stoics were not afraid of death, because once death is here, you're not there. So that's it. You're done. There's nobody to experience it. But how you get there is important. That's what the measure of a person actually is, right? So this is what the premeditatio malorum is supposed to be doing. But you don't have to do it just about that. And in fact, I would suggest not to start it that way because it can be actually fairly difficult to do. It's thinking in detail, visualizing a way in which you might die. And it's not exactly a pleasant thing. So you might not want to start there. Start with something much simpler, like my friend Greg, who regularly has to meditate in that sense about the annoying guy who is certainly going to meet on the subway on the way to his commute, right? The guy that clips his fingernails on the thing, or eats his sandwich and all over the place, or it just bumps into him, or plays music at high volume, or you name it. You have had the experience. You can start with that, and the idea again is the same. However, is that you think ahead of time about challenges, and you get used to the idea that this is going to happen, and it's not. You cannot prevent it. You cannot prevent your own death, and you cannot prevent the jerk on the subway from doing what he's doing. What you can do, however, is to change your mental habit about it. You change your way you think about what's going to happen. The fourth one is mindfulness about your moral choices. This is really crucial. This has changed significantly my way of going throughout the entire day, because you do that almost every minute. The idea is to become more mindful that about even your minor choices that you're making throughout your day actually have an ethical component. Where you bank, therefore where you bring your money, what you eat, therefore what you buy, what kind of chain of supermarkets, or what kind of practices of food raising and so on and so forth you actually support. All of those things. Of course, how you interact with other people, how you treat your colleagues, how you treat your friends, and so on and so forth. All of those have an ethical dimension to it, a moral dimension to it. And so this exercise is supposed to be almost a constant. It becomes sort of second nature. Every time you do something, you start thinking about, but wait, what's the implication of that? Why am I doing it this way as opposed to some other way? Finally, the evening meditation. The evening meditation is, in some sense, the opposite of the morning meditation. You sit down quietly. I do it as a diary, as a sort of writing a diary. And that's what Marcus Aurelius did, right? The meditations by Marcus Aurelius were actually a personal diary. They were not meant for publication. The evening meditation is sort of going over your day, now that it's over, and say, okay, so which challenges did, in fact, I encounter, and how did I do? How well or not well did I do? And according to Seneca, you're supposed to ask yourself 3 questions. What did I do right? And if you did something right, pat yourself on your back, because that's good. What did I do wrong? And the reason you ask yourself that question is not to say, oh, damn, I did that wrong. Because regret is not a Stoic thing. Regret is about the past. The past is done. The only thing you can do about the past is learn from it. So to remind yourself what you did wrong is not to beat yourself up, but it's to learn from your mistakes and say, okay, well, next time I'm going to try to do better because of that. And the third question is, what could I have done otherwise? Maybe there was something in a situation, maybe a situation occurred that you did not expect, that took you, all of a sudden, and you did not have a good way to react to it. But think about it now, and you say, well, actually, I could have done this, or I could have reacted this way. Well, that situation is likely to arise again, because our lives tend to be, repeating the same situation over and over. So next time you're going to know, because now you had time to think about that situation. You had time to think about what might have been a better course of action. So I mentioned Marcus. Let me give you an example of from meditation. So if you can think of Epictetus as the dryly sarcastic Stoic. Think of Marcus as the brooding really somebody who doesn't like people, but he has to live with people, and he's trying to do his best, right? So, and it comes through very clearly through this quote. Say to yourself in the early morning, I shall meet today ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, uncharitable men. All of these things have come upon them through ignorance of real good and ill. I can neither be harmed by any of them, for no man will involve me in wrong, nor can I be angry with my kinsman or hate him, for we have come into the world to work together. This is very profound. It's got a lot of packed into this thing. So on the one hand, he said, look, shit is going to happen. Just be prepared, because people are going to be in a certain way, and especially if you're an emperor. And they're going to do that. So, number one, this is not under your control, so be prepared. Number two, all of these things have come upon them through ignorance of real good or ill. This is a Socratic teaching, that people are not evil. People are just ignorant. Nobody does evil going around the day on purpose wanting to do evil. Nobody, even the most evil people you think of, right, go out there and say, today I'm going to do some evil. Right? They're going to go out there and do something bad because they think it's right. Okay? So the basic idea is remind yourself of that. Those people are doing a bad thing, and you need to correct them if it's in your power. I mean, this guy was emperor. He was correcting people. It was not just going around, fooling around with things. But he was reminding himself that, vengeance is not a good idea because these people are not evil. They're just ignorant. They need to be taught, if they can be taught. Then look at the next one. I can neither be armed by any of them, nor can I be angry because of them. They cannot harm me. Things that people do to me or tell about me cannot harm me because I am in control of my own responses. One of the classical examples here is insult. Apparently, Marcus was insulted a lot by other people, including his wife. And there is a Stoic analogy with the stone. Think of yourself as a stone. You try to go around and insult the stone and see how the stone responds. The stone is completely untouched by your insults. It doesn't care. And the same way would be for a Stoic. He said, sure, you can insult me, but that's your problem, not mine. Okay? Another way to respond to this is suggested by William Irvine, who is a modern Stoic. He's a philosopher. He's a modern Stoic. And he recounts this interesting instance, where he was talking to a colleague, and his colleague said, oh, so I've been thinking about citing one of your papers in my next book. And Irvine said, oh, that's nice. Well, yeah, I haven't decided, says his colleagues, whether you are just misguided or downright evil. Wow, that's a pretty harsh thing to say. And so Irvine thought about it for a second and said, well, that's only because you know a part of what I wrote. If you need the whole thing, you will know that I'm really much worse than you think. That's a Stoic way of dealing with insults, right? So, okay, fine. All of this. So I gave you the basic history. I gave you the basic theory, and I gave you a little bit of the practice. Does it work? Because presumably we are empirically minded people here, right? Evidence-based people. So does it work? Yeah, it does. Right? There is some evidence that it does work. Several lines of evidence. First of all, Stoicism has directly influenced a number of modern type of therapies, including logotherapy, which was introduced by Viktor Frankl after World War II, and cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is arguably the most successful type of therapy, talk therapy that there is out there. It's definitely evidence-based. And it is inspired directly by Stoicism. Some of the techniques of cognitive behavioral therapy, like a negative visualization, for instance, are essentially what I just described a minute ago as the premeditatio malorum. It's the same idea. And we do have evidence that they do work. If your problem is focused on, let's say, you have a fear of elevators or something like that, you can use cognitive behavioral therapy, which essentially uses the premeditatio in a modernized version, and it does work. So that's one source of evidence. Another one is, every November, so it's coming up, there's a thing called Stoic Week. It's organized by a group of researchers, philosophers, and therapists at Exeter University in England. The main event is in London, but it is worldwide because you can actually subscribe to it on their website and download the manual on how to do it, the handbook for how to do it. It's a full week of practice as a Stoic. And so what it is you download this handbook. It tells you day by day what to do, what kind of exercises to do, and how to behave, and take notes about what you're doing. And then when you come in, you will be given a number of, come in as in electronically come in, log in. You will be given a series of questionnaires which measure a number of things that are pertinent to these on a number of scales that are pertinent to these kind of study. And then at the end of the week, you'll be given the same exit questionnaire, and then people have been comparing this for the 3 years that have been doing this. So it's an ongoing experiment. And then a subset of people will actually follow through 6 months later if they decided to actually keep practicing. Now, this is, of course, not a controlled experiment in the sense that there's no double, there's no blind, first of all. No double blind. There is a blind because they don't have access to your information. But there is no double blind. And also, there is no control. This is done with people, only with people who are actually interested in Stoicism, so it's a self-selected sample. Nonetheless, here are the results. After Stoic week, just 1 week, people report about a 16% average on a scale of life satisfaction, increased life satisfaction, 10% increase on a scale of flourishing, 11% increase on a scale of experiencing positive emotions, and 16% reduction in the experience of negative emotions. This is after 1 week. If you keep practicing for 6 months, these numbers go up. Not a lot. I mean, they get into the 15, 20%, 25%, but still, that's pretty good for 6 months practice. So there is some evidence that this thing works. Although I would caution, of course, that there is a distinction between a therapy, where it does make sense to ask, does it work or does it not work empirically, and a philosophy of life. In the case of a philosophy of life, it doesn't really make much sense to say, does it work or does it not work, because the question is, does it work for you? Is it something that resonates for you? Is it something that helps you? The fact that it does or it does not help other people is entirely irrelevant. So Stoicism may or may not be your cup of tea. If it is, great. If it isn't, great. But that's not the kind of thing that it really makes much sense to submit to empirical scrutiny. And that's my last slide. Thanks very much.